Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. So in this week's video I have quite a treat. I'm going to be comparing a whole load of old video cards, PCI, Visa Local Bus and ISA, including some fairly rare ones. Now these are cards that I've collected over a period of years, and of course I've assembled all the cards from machines of a certain era that I own, although I don't own quite this many machines. Majority of these cards in fact came from a recycling sale, so I effectively picked them up for between €1 and €2 each. So there are also a handful of fairly rare cards in there, especially some of the older ISA cards, original VGA cards, and so I'm really looking forward to benchmarking those because I have not done any benchmarking on them. In fact, I don't even know whether they'll run in the benchmarks. So I'm going to use the benchmarking suite of Phil's Computer Lab. Thanks again, Phil. He's done all the hard work for us and put together that suite so we can just use it. And of course he may have actually benchmarked a few of these cards himself. He's actually done a lot of benchmarking of old cards. But I think some of these are rare enough that they're probably not in his list. And so I think this will be very interesting. So I'm going to compare them all in the same machine. I have a machine with Visa Local Bus, ISA and PCI slots. So let me show you the machine. Now those of you who watched last week's video might imagine that I would use the 486 that I built, the big box 486, which by the way now has a 17-inch monitor, as you can see. But I'm actually not going to use that machine because this one, well, we had some issues last week with complaints about a lack of Visa BIOS, and I think that's probably to do with the motherboard rather than the video cards. And also this has Visa Local Bus and ISA in it, but it doesn't have PCI. So if you did watch that video, you can probably guess which machine that I'm going to use. So of course this is the machine that I'm going to use. It's the one in the semi-compact case, and it's the motherboard with the non-working Visa Local Bus slot, although of course we have one that does work as well, so that's the one we'll use. I've put 20 megabytes of RAM in it, and of course it's got the 486 DX4100 with write-through cache, and I put a 500 megabyte hard drive in, which I actually had a lot of trouble getting to work. It seems that I had a faulty cable. Other than that, there's just a CD-ROM and floppy drive, so this is a perfectly standard machine, and so I think this should be satisfactory for testing out all of these different cards. Okay, so let me start by showing you the video cards that we're going to be comparing today. So I'll start with all the Visa Local Bus cards, and I've got here a Cirrus Logic GD5428. Now these have a reputation of being really fast, so I'm looking forward to seeing whether it lives up to the hype. Unfortunately, this is not a branded card as far as I can see. It's just something that's come out of an old 486 DX266 according to the label. But it'll be very interesting to compare that with some of the others to see whether it really was the king of graphics cards. And this is another GD5428, so it'll be good to compare two just to see whether they really live up to the hype or whether there was some dependence on implementation of the card. Very often if you've got faster video RAM, that makes all the difference. So there's a GD5424, which is an older model Cirrus Logic, again Visa Local Bus. The next one's a really rare one, well at least it's hard to get and very much sought after, so they're quite expensive. So this is a branded Hercules card from 1993, and it's a Dynamite VL Pro version 8.00 high, no idea what the high stands for. And it's a Senglabs ET4000W32. So again, this has a reputation of being a real speed freak, so it'd be really great to compare that with the GD5428 from Cirrus Logic. The other end of the spectrum performance-wise is this other card, the V7 Vega. Now, this is quite rare and old, and I haven't seen comparisons of this that I recall anyway. So I'm looking forward to seeing this. I mean, it is a Visa Local Bus implementation, so it shouldn't be too badly bottlenecked by the slot. and yeah, at the same time it's a really old chipset. So I don't know how this will perform. I literally have no idea. So that's going to be really interesting to find out. I don't even know whether some of these cards will actually run the benchmarks. So for the ISA cards, let's start with the ones that I expect to be slower. Again, this is a rare card, and I actually just bought this this past week. So it's a Paradise Top VGA Expert card, and the chipset is PVGA 1A-JK. So again, I expect this to be really slow. I've just noticed that the switches on this don't seem to be accessible from the outside, which is kind of a weird configuration. But yeah, that's going to be an interesting one again, just because of its rarity and age. Well, of course, if we can get it to run the benchmarks. Another really old one is this Oak one. It's an OTI VGA, and the chipset on this says OTI 087 from Oak Technology. And again, it's really the rarity factor rather than the performance that I'm looking into here. So then we have some other cards which are reputedly very slow. That is the Trident cards. If you open a random machine from a certain era, you'll probably find something like this. So this is a TVGA 8900CL, and they have a performance of performing really rotten. So it'll be interesting to see whether that's actually the case or whether they had some hits along the way. So this Trident is a TVGA 9000B. That's a very common card, and again, you'll find those in a lot of machines that you open. This is a Trident, again a TVGA 8900C, so I think that'll be fairly comparable to the other one. And again, it'll be interesting just to see whether any of the Trident cards are worth having or whether they're just all universally bad. So for Senglabs we have an ET4000AX. Again, this is highly sought after, but bear in mind that this is an ISA implementation, so it should be bottlenecked by the slot itself. So sometimes just buying video cards based on chipset isn't enough. And then we have this one here, which is an older Senglabs, and it's an ET3000AX. So that one should be, again, quite interesting. You can see that it actually has discrete oscillators on there. When I first looked at it, I thought it said 900 megahertz, which would have been pretty hilarious, but yeah, it's a 44.9 megahertz crystal. So I don't know. This looks like it could have been a branded one. It looks like it has something like DRARA as a brand or something like this. I'm not really sure. But it is Senglabs, so sought after, but it's only the 3000AX, so should be quite slow. So those are the ISA cards. So I ran into a small problem already. This Paradise VGA card that I bought this week, I noticed that there is no hole to access the switches here. Now, of course, that's not a major problem for me personally. It seems that the slot cover has been replaced at some point. But when I plug it in, you can see that there's more than a centimetre of gap between where it's supposed to screw in and where the top of the slot cover is. And obviously, somebody, the seller or somebody else, has replaced the slot cover with one that looks good enough to sell online, but actually isn't correct for this card. Now you might ask, well, why can't I just take one off a cheap PCI or AGP video card and screw it on here? And the answer is that those are usually screwed to the board, and they have you know, little lugs that stick out like this, and they're on the other side of the slot cover because the boards face that direction, not this direction. And the other problem is that, of course, these connectors here will also be around the other way, so the D shape will be the wrong way around on those kinds of boards. So that narrows it down to using just an ISA video card, most of which are not cheap. There are some that are cheap, but it's almost impossible to find ones with a connector in this position. This is very high up on the board, and of course it would be nice to get one with a hole here as well. Now the problem is that I can only find, out of looking at hundreds of these, around two different models of video card that seem to have a connector in about the right position, namely this one and one other card. And of course I can't guarantee that the other card would be in the right position, so the only way I could be sure would be to get another card that's exactly the same as this, which of course is going to cost a lot of money. I mean, these cards, people sell them for more than $100. I didn't pay that much for this particular one, but yeah, there was no mention in the listing of this problem with this card. So that totally devalues the card. It's fine to do a benchmark for, but useless to put in a build, especially if you were trying to sell builds, which I'm not, but still I like my computers to have components that work together. So this will go back to the seller, and I'm just extremely disappointed that it wasn't mentioned in the listing. So I thought I'd show the slowest and fastest cards in action, so I won't reveal what they are yet until we get to the benchmarks. But out of the ISA and VISA local bus ones, this is running at 12.3 frames a second, and I think this is the point at which the eye starts to sense some kind of smooth animation going on. And of course this would be unplayable by modern standards, but when something's just rotating in front of you, this is about the speed you want to see it running at before it starts to look smooth-ish. Of course, if it's moving backwards and forwards very fast in front of you, then it won't be so fast. So the other one I'll show you is the PC player benchmark, and this is a lot slower. It gives an average of 8.3 frames a second, although of course the lowest frame rate here is much lower than that. I'm also a little bit suspicious about some of these frame rates. They might be a little bit higher than they should be, but yeah, so this is the slowest one at 8.3 frames a second. Now I'll show you the fastest card. So this is the fastest card of the ISA and VISA local bus ones, and it's at a whopping 40.5 frames a second. And of course this looks completely smooth. There is a little bit of frame tearing going on, but otherwise it is rotating extremely smoothly and quite quickly. So I'll also show you the PC player benchmark, and that one also runs extremely smoothly. So the frame rate here is much lower than we were getting in the Chris 3D benchmark. So it's actually only 13.5 frames a second, but you can see at the maximum, where it's going at its fastest, it's really very smooth, and really even at its slowest point it's only just noticeably jerking. So this is obviously a very good card, so let's move on to the benchmarks themselves and see how they all came out. So the first benchmark is this 3D bench one, and for those who are familiar with Phil's benchmark, this is the one for the fast video cards, but it doesn't really matter anyway. The values are almost exactly the same between the slow and fast version of this benchmark. So you can see there's a big split between the ISA cards and the VISA local bus cards. In fact, you can see the VLB cards are almost 3 times the speed of the ISA ones. And so it seems like the real lesson to be learned here is, you know, get a VISA local bus card. They're much better than the ISA cards. In fact, I have to wonder, with 3 of the ISA cards all sitting at exactly 24.8, whether the ISA bus is actually just bottlenecking all of these chipsets. A big surprise for me was that the Sanglabs ET3000 only scored 17.8 frames per second and was actually easily the slowest card in the lineup here. So of course Sanglabs cards are highly sought after, and indeed the ET4000 does reach that 24.8 mark, but not the 3000. It's quite a slow card. The other big surprise was the Trident cards. So notice that the TVGA 8900CL is significantly faster than the 8900C, and moreover, that's a Trident card, and hey, it's the best out of the ISA cards that are there. So that was quite surprising. I was also really surprised to find the V7 Vega Visa Local Bus card at 57.8 there was equivalent to the Cirrus Logic cards. And there doesn't seem to be any difference at all in the 5424 and 5428 Cirrus Logic cards. I also tried the second 5428 card, but all of the benchmarks were exactly the same for that card, so I just omitted that from the benchmarks. So there's just one of the GD 5428 in every benchmark that I'll show. And of course the outright winner was the Sanglabs ET4000/W32 Visa local bus card. It just seemed to always get a little bit ahead of the other cards in the lineup. So yeah, those are the timings, and I guess that Oak card must be more recent than I thought it was, because that's obviously performing very, very well. But yeah, it's not really a surprise that the Paradise VGA was quite a bit slower than some of the other ISA cards there. So here are the Chris 3D benchmarks, and this is the one with the rotating yellow cube that I showed. And pretty much the story is exactly the same here. The Oak ET4000 and the Trident 8900CL are all at 20 frames a second and look like they're just being bottlenecked somehow. The Sanglabs ET4000/W32 is at 40.5 and is the outright winner, and it just seems to get a little bit ahead of the other cards, which are all on exactly the same score. So you see basically exactly the same pattern across all of these benchmarks as well. Now the Chris 3D benchmark also runs at 64480, or at least it does if your card has a Visa BIOS. So you can see that the three older cards there and the Trident TVGA 8900C didn't support the 64480 benchmark at all, and so they dropped out. The Sanglabs ET4000 did support it at 64480, which would lead one to conclude that it has a Visa BIOS, but interestingly you'll notice in one of the later benchmarks that it drops out again with exactly the same message about no Visa BIOS. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But once again, the Trident TVGA 8900CL is basically at the top of the pack. In the ET4000 actually just slightly beat it, but not by enough to matter. And again, the ET4000 is just a little bit ahead of all of the other cards. So this is the PC player benchmark, and I think the surprising thing here is that the Visa local bus cards are only just slightly ahead of the ISA ones here, so there's no factor of 3 in this benchmark. So I guess that benchmark is designed not just to test the graphics cards, but also to test the performance of the CPU, and we're just seeing more of that here. But otherwise, everything is exactly the same as we see it in all the other benchmarks. There's nothing really interesting to report here. The ET4000 comes out ahead of everything, and as usual, 3 of the ISA cards are all at the same speed. So the PC player benchmark also runs at 64480. And an interesting thing here is that the Sanglabs ET4000 has dropped out here. So this doesn't have a Visa BIOS in this case. And of course you can see that the Sanglabs ET4000AX has also gone there. So that was kind of interesting, because that one had actually run a 64480 benchmark before, as we saw, but it doesn't work here. So, one might think that maybe one of these Cirrus Logic cards or this V7 Vega card might be a good one to pick up because at least they support these benchmarks. On the other hand, if you look at the performance we're getting here at 4.7 frames per second, it's hardly playable. So whether or not you support 640 by 480 is probably more or less irrelevant. So this is the Doom benchmark, and I used the maximum settings here rather than the minimum because I don't think anyone would ever realistically play Doom on minimum settings. So the problem with this benchmark, of course, is it doesn't give you frames per second, but something called real ticks. And of course, smaller is better here. So you can see again that the Sanglabs ET4000 just slightly beats the other cards that are there, but not by very much. In fact, the Cirrus Logic one is actually just slightly ahead, although this is probably just, an error in the measurement. I wouldn't, put too much store in that particular number that's there. And again, you can see that the ET3000 is easily the worst card here. And pretty much everything else matches exactly what we've seen on the other benchmarks. So these are the Quake benchmarks, and I have to say that at 320 by 200, this is really just not playable. I mean, I think it's barely playable at maybe 9.8, but I think this is still too low. You can see the jerking, and I think it would be very hard to play. So this is maybe not a good benchmark to use for these particular cards. But once again, we see all exactly the same sort of for performance comparison here. When we did the Doom benchmarks, the frame rates were a bit higher than this, and to me, at least on a Visa local bus, the Doom max settings would be basically playable, I think. But yeah, certainly I wouldn't want to be playing Quake on this, and this, aligns with what we know about Quake, is that you really had to have a good Pentium machine to get a really good performance out of that game. And just for fun, here is Quake at 360 by 480. This takes ages to run, and it's really not worth it. I mean, 4.6 frames per second is the best you're going to get, and that is totally unplayable. You certainly wouldn't want to run this game at that speed. So again, pretty much everything follows the same contour as we've seen before. The ET3000 is the worst card. We've got 3 cards that are ISA that are all the same speed, and the Sanglabs ET4000 is the best card. But notice in all the benchmarks that the ET4000 was only just a little bit faster than the Cirrus Logic cards and the V7 Vega card. So that was quite surprising to me. I expected there to be a little bit more of a difference, and I'd say you'd be okay to buy any of those cards, although as we saw, that Sanglabs card had a problem with the Visa BIOS for one of those benchmarks. Now, Quake doesn't actually run at 640 by 480 for any of these cards, and I'm sure that's nothing to do with the cards, but with Quake itself. I don't know whether it just doesn't run on a 486 in that resolution because it would be totally unusable, or whether there's actually something wrong with the version of Quake that's used in the benchmark. But anyway, I didn't bother trying to put benchmarks in because it just simply doesn't run for any of the cards at that resolution. Anyway, that's all I'm going to do for this week. So next week, look out for the PCI timings and benchmarks. And I think it's going to be really interesting. So some people claim that the PCI cards should be better than the Visa local bus cards because by this stage, card manufacturers had really got on top of graphics and found lots of ways to speed things up. But other people say, well, it shouldn't really make much difference because the Visa local bus and the PCI bus are basically running at the same speed. And if anything, the Visa local bus is sort of almost directly tied to the CPU, so it might even have a slight advantage. So I think that's going to be a really interesting comparison. And well, this video is already long enough, so we're going to leave that for next week. But if you want to see that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also turn the notifications on so you know the moment the video goes up. So we'll see you in a later video. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you later. Bye.